You and a number of national security advisors wrote a paper cautioning against military attack on Iran. Do you believe Iran's pursuing a nuclear weapon?
Well, that's not an exact indication of what the paper was about.
You want more
discussion. The paper made no recommendations, and the only conclusion the paper reached was there should be an informed debate. But 6 months ago, a number of us were worried about the fact that the debate was taking place with no factual basis. So we attempted to do so. But the paper says very much the individual reading it ought to make up their own mind. It lists the costs and benefits. Admittedly, the costs are a longer list than the benefits, but that's only a superficial expression of the paper. The paper itself, in fact, makes it very clear that there could be a delay in an Iran program for about 4 years if the U.S. were to attack. But it lists a whole series of costs, including the fact that the Iranians could asymmetrically attack American citizens overseas and American facilities, and indeed that it might actually provoke a decision by Iran to make a nuclear weapon, which gets to the second part of your question. We agree with U.S. and Israeli intelligence that there is no decision on the part of Iran to make a nuclear weapon. But I also believe, as a lot of people believe, that Iran has made a decision to put itself into a position where, should a decision be made to make a nuclear weapon, it would have the technology, the equipment, the knowledge to be able to do that.
Now, an Israeli strike, you say in this paper, could take out a facility for just 2 years. So is U.S. intervention necessary to be effective?
Neither is effective if the objective is to stop forever an Iranian nuclear program. That, we say, would take a great deal more, perhaps including a land invasion which would pale into significance what we had to do in Iraq and Afghanistan.
And so how much of an option is that really? You say you're not taking a position, but that sounds like it's a fairly high cost to take any kind of...
We think it is a high cost, and we've thought it's a high cost all along. And I think we thought that in 2002 and 2003, when the decision was made to go into Iraq, the debate about the costs seemed never to have taken place. And so our deep concern was that there ought to be a debate in the United States about the pros and cons of this action, what could be achieved and with how much, and what would be palpably and possibly have to pay for it, rather than just to slip into the notion that 1 or 2 bombs would solve the whole problem for us.
This week we've seen demonstrations on the streets of Tehran, some vocalization about the impact of the sanctions. Iran's the most sanctioned country in the world at this point because of the U.S. and the EU. Do you think that what's happening now on the ground is going to impact the calculus on the part of the U.S. and Israel about what options are on the table?
I believe that sanctions alone are not going to solve the problem, but sanctions coupled with diplomacy at least have some chance.
Now, that's an important point, because the justification for the sanctions is that they are going to hurt the centrifuges, hurt the ability to get the material to develop a weapon. That's a justification for them right now.
I think that's too narrow a justification. I think the justification the Secretary uses is that we have a 2-track policy, and that one of those tracks is sanctions and the other track is diplomacy. And last year we started diplomacy intensively. It hasn't panned out yet. On the other hand, I have to tell you that I think diplomacy is still in the horse for a rabbit stage. That means that the Iranians want a horse, but they're offering a rabbit. But I also think that the U.S. wants a horse, but it seems to be offering a rabbit. Maybe after the elections we can see a rabbit for a rabbit or a horse for a horse come along.
It sounds like you're saying there's some politics that are clouding the issue right now.
Well, I think that we're in an election period, and no president in an election period wants to appear to be entering into diplomatic compromises, particularly if they involve taking some risks. I think the good news is that both our report and Secretary Panetta believe there is time, and time is very important for diplomacy to work. Not time to be wasted, but time obviously to engage.
Iran has said the 20% freeze in terms of enrichment levels is an option they'd consider if all of the sanctions are taken away.
Well, the rabbit is the 20% freeze, and the horse is getting rid of all the sanctions immediately, maybe even before the freeze. On the other hand, those are ideas that can be worked with, because one could see some sanctions relief for a 20% freeze at the start, then followed on by things that would involve more concrete limitations on enrichment. more expanded role for the IAEA with respect to inspections, more ironclad commitments by Iran down the road that it would stay out of the military area, and a clear definition of what that would involve, and then some thoughts about the fact that they would be able to tell us how much of this low enriched material they really think they need to guard against Russian failure to provide fuel to their one reactor.
Now, U.S. negotiators have said they don't want to have talks for talk's sake. What sort of incentive or what sort of proposal do you think is a viable one?
Well, I've just discussed some of the elements of one. It's not up to me, obviously, to design a proposal.
Right.
But I think there are enough elements there in each side, horses and rabbits, to make a possible proposal come forward. Mm-hmm. One of the first would be a kind of 20%, as I said, for some cooperation on sanctions, for some further efforts on the part of the United States. Why not, for example, see if we could find a way to make the Tehran research reactor more efficient at making cancer isotopes? We believe that that's a possibility. That means that Iran's plans currently to build 4 more reactors like that wouldn't have to be carried out and would save them all the cost of doing it. Why not put more of the 20% material into fuel plates, into a form that isn't readily and easily upgradable to weapons type material?
And this proposal or this idea would involve the IAEA being the intermediary?
Of course, they could be both the intermediary, but more importantly, they would be the people who would do the monitoring and inspection to make sure that the proposal is being carried out effectively and in keeping with the treaty.
Now, diplomats are not supposed to be partisan, but you can certainly lay out the chessboard for us. What happens if a Republican administration, Mitt Romney, becomes president? How does that change your projection?
Well, I think that both presidents have said that they're not taking military action off the table, so they're not too different there. I think that President Obama has at least implied that he would be willing to use military action if he thought it were necessary to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And there's an implication there, at least, that would come about because we had a very clear indication, and I think we would, and our report makes that clear, that Iran had made such a decision because it would have to take certain actions to carry those out. I think under those circumstances that our report at least says, okay, there may well be a time and a place for that kind of action, but it also makes it clear the costs are so high that one would want to, at least as an initial effort, do everything possible to exhaust the diplomatic opportunities before having to move to that direction.